The movie starts by introducing Billy Rosati, a man eager to meet his boss, a powerful mobster named Don Gaetano Cesare. When Billy arrives, a small misunderstanding quickly turns into a heated argument between him and Cesare, and it almost leads to violence. Thankfully, Nicky Donatelli, Billy's loyal right-hand man, steps in and manages to calm everyone down, defusing the tension. With the argument settled, Billy and Nicky leave Cesari's residence, where Cesare continues his dinner party, surrounded by his loyal henchmen. Shortly after, Frank Castle, a mysterious and deadly vigilante, sneaks into Cesari's house. He ruthlessly takes down everyone in sight, leaving a massacre behind, including Cesare himself. Outside, two police officers are keeping an eye on the house when they suddenly hear the sound of gunfire. One of the officers, Saffiati, rushes inside to investigate and comes face to face with Frank, who is about to escape. Saffiati draws his gun, but hesitates when he realizes that the man in front of him is the infamous Frank Castle. Instead of stopping him, Saffiati lets Frank go, even handing over his car keys so Frank can get away faster. To cover up what he did, Saffiati punches himself in the nose, causing it to bleed, and pretends that Frank attacked him. Saffiati and his partner then call for backup. When the police arrive, Saffiati fabricates a story, claiming that Frank assaulted him and stole his car before fleeing the scene. Meanwhile, at another location, three young men from the Urban Free Flow gang visit Billy at his headquarters. These men are drug couriers whom Billy trusts because they are skilled and reliable. However, Billy and his men are unaware that Frank Castle has already infiltrated their base. Frank silently takes out the guard stationed outside and moves inside, where he continues his brutal assault on Billy's henchmen. In the chaos, Frank accidentally kills Nicky, who is shockingly revealed to be an undercover FBI agent. Frank and Billy got into a fierce shootout, and during the chaos, Billy stumbled and fell into a glass-crushing machine. The accident left him horribly disfigured, with his face badly mangled. Even though he was seriously injured, Billy managed to survive. After taking out all of Billy's men, Frank quickly fled the scene. The next day, at Nicky Donatelli's funeral, Nicky's FBI partner, Paul Budiansky, was filled with anger. He was furious at his superior, Agent Miller, for assigning Nicky to a dangerous mission involving Billy Rosati and his ruthless crew. But Miller brushed off Paul's frustration, saying he never expected Frank Castle to show up and kill all of Cesari's and Billy's men. Paul then approached Nicky's grieving wife, Angela, and made a solemn promise. He would capture Frank Castle, the man responsible for Nicky's death. Meanwhile, Frank was also at the funeral, watching from a distance. He took a moment to visit the graves of his own family nearby, lost in painful memories of the brutal massacre that had taken them away. The heartache still tortured him, driving his relentless quest for vengeance. Later, Paul went to the local police station, where he questioned the police force's poor efforts in catching Frank Castle. Known to everyone as the Punisher, Frank had been acting as a vigilante for 4 years, and the police had failed to stop him. The conversation turned into a heated argument until a police officer named Saffiati suggested that Paul speak to Martin Soap, a fellow officer who had been investigating Frank for a long time. Martin explained to Paul that Frank used to be a Special Forces operative. His life took a dark turn when his wife and daughter were murdered by the Mafia. Since then, Frank had become the Punisher, determined to bring his own brand of justice to those who ruined his life. After losing his family, Frank devoted his life to fighting crime on his own terms. He refused to follow the law, believing that not all criminals get the punishment they deserve. In his mind, it was up to him to make sure justice was served, even if it meant taking matters into his own hands. Elsewhere, Frank confided in one of his allies, a man nicknamed Microchip. Frank admitted that he had accidentally killed an innocent FBI agent. The guilt weighed heavily on him, especially after learning that the man had a loving wife and daughter. Frank could deeply relate to their pain, having experienced the same kind of loss. Microchip, who was a skilled informant and supplier of weapons, tried to comfort Frank as he delivered the equipment Frank needed. But Frank, filled with regret, asked Microchip to leave him alone. Meanwhile, Billy found out some shocking news from his men. They had discovered that Nicky Donatelli was actually an undercover FBI agent. Not only that, but they also revealed that Nikki had been secretly hiding all the money from their drug deals. One of Billy's men, Pitsy, said he knew where Nikki lived and was certain the money was kept at Nikki's house. Just then, a doctor came in to remove the bandages from Billy's face. But when the doctor saw the extent of the damage, he couldn't hide his horror. Billy's face had become even more monstrous, so terrifying that one of his henchmen, Ink, threw up at the sight. Pitsy quickly dragged Ink outside and scolded him for being disrespectful. When they came back into the room, they discovered that Billy had killed the doctor in a fit of rage for failing to fix his face. As they left, Billy laid out his plan to Ink and Pitsy. He was determined to get his money back and, more importantly, to hunt down and kill Frank Castle. The scene shifts to a gloomy treatment room in a mental hospital, where Jim, Billy's younger brother, is being held. Jim is a violent psychopath and murderer, so dangerous that he has to be strapped down tightly to keep him under control. A male nurse treats Jim harshly, speaking to him rudely and without care. Suddenly, Billy and his men storm into the room, breaking Jim free from his restraints. Jim is stunned when he sees Billy's drastically altered face. However, instead of being horrified, he thinks his brother looks incredible, more frightening and dangerous than ever. Once Jim is free, he immediately seeks revenge on the cruel nurse, torturing him mercilessly before killing him in a brutal and gruesome way. Later, the four of them head to a hotel. There, Billy catches a glimpse of his own reflection in the mirror. He is visibly shocked and heartbroken at the sight of his disfigured face. Seeing his brother's distress, Jim tries to comfort him, promising that together they will find Frank and make him pay. To ease Billy's pain, Jim smashes all the mirrors in the room, trying to help his brother feel better. That evening, Frank goes to Nikki's house to see Angela. He wants to apologize for killing Nikki, so he brings a bundle of cash as a gesture of regret. But Angela, still grieving and furious, grabs a gun and points it at Frank, forcing him to leave her home. Meanwhile, Billy and his men have a meeting with a powerful drug lord named Christu. During the meeting, one of Krista's men mocks Billy's scarred face, and Billy flies into a rage, killing the man on the spot. The situation nearly escalates into a full-blown fight, but Krista steps in and manages to calm everyone down. He apologizes to Billy, and they finally agree to move forward with a planned transaction at the dock. The following day, Frank meets with Microchip at his house and announces that he's ready to retire as the Punisher and leave the city for good. Microchip, however, delivers troubling news. Billy Rosati is still alive and determined to get revenge on Frank. Hearing this, Frank changes his mind about retiring. He is now more resolute than ever to take down Billy and his gang. Frank works with Microchip and a man named Carlos to come up with a plan. Carlos provides crucial information about Billy's henchmen, including a dangerous criminal named Majesty and his gang, who are planning a robbery. Meanwhile, Paul decides to partner up with Martin in an effort to track down and capture Frank. That night, Frank tracks down Majesty and his gang, who are busy with their crime. He storms in and launches a brutal assault, taking them all down. After interrogating Majesty and getting the details he needs about Billy, Frank kills him. Just as Frank finishes, Paul and Martin arrive at the scene and spot him. They immediately chase after him, and Paul catches up, leading to an intense and fierce fight between the two. In the struggle, Frank manages to overpower Paul, knocking him to the ground. But it turns out to be a trap. Paul was only pretending to be beaten, using the moment to capture Frank. Frank desperately explains that he needs to be released because Billy and his men are on their way to Angela's house to find the money from the drug sales that Nikki had hidden. But Paul isn't moved and stubbornly puts handcuffs on Frank. Meanwhile, Billy and his henchmen arrive at Angela's house. They barge in, taking Angela and her daughter hostage. Billy demands to know where the drug money is, believing Nikki might have hidden it there. Angela, terrified, insists she has no idea where the money is. As Billy interrogates her, Jim begins smashing objects around the house, creating chaos and adding to the tension. The noise from the chaos reached two police officers who were patrolling nearby. When they arrived at Angela's house, Jim attacked them savagely, killing them both. Angela, terrified and desperate to protect her daughter, revealed that her late husband had a safe in their room and gave them the code to open it. Meanwhile, Paul arrived outside the house and told Martin to keep an eye on Frank, who was still handcuffed in the back seat of their car. As Paul went inside, Frank pleaded with Martin to set him free, revealing that Martin had secretly been working as his informant within the police. Inside the house, Ink and Pitsy were ready for Paul's arrival. They threatened him, warning that any sudden moves would put Angela and her daughter in danger. Billy, furious when he discovered that the safe didn't contain the money he was looking for, lost his temper and caused a commotion, which Jim eagerly joined in on. Pitsy, hearing the disturbance, ordered Ink to go upstairs and check things out. But before Ink could react, Frank burst in and took him down in a fierce fight. Paul seized a chance to grab his gun and aimed at Pitsy, but Frank acted faster, killing Pitsy to protect everyone. Frank then quickly moved to rescue Angela and her daughter. Just then, Billy and Jim stormed down the stairs, firing at Paul. Paul had to dodge their gunfire, allowing Frank to escape with Angela and her daughter. Billy and Jim didn't get far, though. Paul and Martin managed to capture them and brought them to the police station. Meanwhile, Frank took Angela and her daughter to a safe hiding place. There, he comforted Angela's daughter by giving her some of his own daughter's old toys, trying to bring a smile to the little girl's face. Billy and Jim were later taken to FBI headquarters, where Agent Miller made them an offer. If they agreed to help the FBI catch Christou and his gang, they would be set free. Without hesitation, Billy and Jim accepted the deal. The two brothers then went to the docks, pretending to make a deal with Christou. FBI agents lay in wait, ready to ambush Christou and his men. With Billy and Jim's help, the FBI successfully arrested Christou, and true to their word, the FBI released the brothers. Agent Miller didn't stop there. He also gave Billy information about Microchip, one of Frank Castle's closest allies. In another part of town, Carlos informed Frank that Microchip couldn't meet with him because his mother was very ill. Hearing this, Frank asked Carlos to look after Angela and her daughter while he went to check on Microchip. When Frank arrived at Microchip's house, he found a heartbreaking scene. Microchip's mother had died under tragic circumstances, and Microchip himself was nowhere to be found. Alarmed, Frank rushed back to his hiding spot, only to discover Carlos gravely wounded and barely clinging to life. He realized that Jim had kidnapped Angela and her daughter. With his last breath, Carlos begged Frank to end his pain. Reluctantly, Frank did as Carlos asked, putting him out of his misery. Meanwhile, Billy and Jim had devised a cruel plan. They intended to use Microchip, Angela, and her daughter as bait to trap Frank and kill him. Frank soon met with Paul, who revealed that Billy and Jim had been released. Paul then urged Frank to deal with them in his own way, since the law couldn't touch them. Frank agreed, but he warned Paul that if he wanted to help, he'd have to give up his badge and his job as a federal agent. Paul, willing to do whatever it took, seemed prepared for the risk. Elsewhere, Billy and Jim visited a bar to recruit some new allies and prepare for their revenge against Frank Castle. Frank kept a close eye on their hideout, which was now heavily guarded by men armed to the teeth. At the same time, Paul went to see Tiberiu, Krista's father, with a proposal. He offered to work together to get revenge on Billy, who had put Krista behind bars. Tiberiu, eager to avenge his son, immediately agreed. Later that night, Tiberiu and a group of his trusted men arrived at Billy's hideout, pretending to be mercenaries who wanted to help fight the Punisher. Inside the building, Angela, her daughter, and Microchip were locked up in a small room, held captive as part of Billy and Jim's twisted scheme. Tiberiu gave the order for his men to attack Billy's crew inside the building, and a chaotic gunfight erupted. While the battle raged on downstairs, Frank sneaked into the building from the upper floors, silently taking out several of Billy's men. However, he soon found himself in a brutal fight with Jim. Despite being highly skilled as a former Special Forces operative, Frank was struggling. Jim managed to break free from the fight and ran into the room where the hostages were being held. Inside the room, Billy had his gun aimed at Microchip, while Jim threatened Angela and her daughter with his weapon. Frank was faced with a heartbreaking choice: save his best friend, Microchip, or rescue Angela and her daughter. He made the painful decision to save Angela and her little girl, knowing it meant losing his closest friend. Billy shot and killed Microchip, and Frank, filled with rage, turned his attention to Jim. He killed Jim and then, fueled by fury, confronted Billy. Frank beat Billy viciously, making sure he died a slow and painful death. With Billy and his gang defeated, Frank rescued Angela and her daughter. Paul, knowing the police would soon arrive, urged Frank to leave quickly. Angela, grateful and forgiving, hugged Frank and told him she had forgiven him for what had happened. As Frank left the scene with Martin, Martin tried to persuade Frank to give up his life as a vigilante, suggesting that once all the criminals were gone, he could find peace. But Martin changed his mind in an instant when a mugger suddenly tried to rob him. Before the mugger could do any harm, Frank swiftly stepped in and handled the situation in his usual Punisher style, proving that his fight was far from over. So the moral of the story is, if you're going to pick a fight with a vigilante, make sure you don't end up on his bad side, where you might just get your revenge plan turned into an action-packed disaster.